The 4th of July does not usually fall on a Sunday, and so I don't usually have this long moment of, what, amazement, that these are the readings selected to accompany our worship today. This Episcopal branch, as Bishop Michael says, this Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement, this American branch of the Anglican Communion, has marked Independence Day, which we think of as a secular holiday. They have marked it as a holy day to be observed, among other holy days. But a birthday, shouldn't it? A birthday should be linked with celebrations, with special food, with games and storytelling and speeches and general hilarity and merriment. Ships at sea should fire cannon salutes. John Adams, having seen the whole thing through, called for all that, and he thought there should be bonfires and foot races on the 4th forever and ever. It was a victory, after all. Not one shred of reconciliation about it. So me, if I'd been alive in that dawn and picking and choosing texts for the day of victory, I'm sure I would have come up with other ideas. I would have come up with something like, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we laughed, our mouth was filled. I would have picked something like that. I would have picked something like, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Or how about this? Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof. That works. What choices could be more obvious? And yet, in these heady days of 1785, when we were just getting used to the idea that we were now our own nation, our newly independent American church, Philadelphia, of course, gathered and saw no more apropos texts for the Day of Independence than these two things, which sound to me like warnings as much as anything else, as if God maybe thought we weren't always going to play this game his way. Circumcise your hearts. I'm backing up one verse. Circumcise your hearts and be stiff-necked no longer. Cut away the thickness that surrounds that heart of yours. The Lord your God shows no partiality, takes no bribes, executes justice for the fatherless, the orphan, and the widow, loves the foreigners, provides them food and clothing. So you also should love the foreigner, because you yourselves went as foreigners in the land of Egypt, and you were foreigners the entire time. You were slaves in Egypt. The second warning, love your enemies. Love your enemies and pray for them. If you love only those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors, the very worst sinners, do not even the Gentiles do that. I think it's a moment. I'll tell you a little story about war and reconciliation. I think this is kind of charming. The story of the infant Episcopal Church in the United States is enmeshed with the story of the infancy of the United States of America, okay? More than half I bet 2/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were members of this church, at least nominally. A number of American clergy and bishops, okay, were loyalists all through the war. Their homes were ransacked and burned by mobs, and many of them fled to Nova Scotia or to England. But the very first bishop in the United States Church, in the Episcopal Church, was Samuel Seabury, who had been minister at Trinity Church in New York City, and was unashamedly loyal to the British Crown all through the Revolution. He did not blush to lead the congregation in prayers for King George III, with George Washington sitting right in the pew. It seems there are such things as charmed lives, and it looks to me like Seabury had a charmed life, because his home, too, was trashed and burned. Even though he was publicly paraded through the streets and humiliated, there he is in 1785 being elected Bishop of Connecticut. So, the musical Hamilton aside, He did not remain a loyalist to the end of his life. I don't want to take up too much time on these little stories about our own dear Episcopal Church. There are two points I want to come to now. Do you notice that in the two readings, the two warnings that are with us, all of these you shall love, you shall not oppress, all of these are cast in the plural, okay? In both readings, they are addressing a crowd of people. God, of course, delights in the good choices you make, the generous conduct that you and me make. But these commandments and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount are simply not addressing individuals. God is addressing us communally. God knows any one of us coming upon an abandoned or a starving child. We know we would be cut to the heart as individuals. And if God accused me of not caring about that child, I would quickly react. I would say, no, I'm not like that. I do care. When have I ever, okay? But God is thinking that even nice persons can allow our covenant community to grow identified with our collective wealth. And as a nation, we wouldn't allow our country to become clutching, would we, or mean, would we? Do you all notice that in the books of Moses, whenever God instructs the covenant people to show love and acceptance to foreigners, some Bibles say resident aliens, those who are among them, do you notice that in the same sentence, God invariably reminds us that the reason for this is that our Hebrew ancestors arrived in the status of foreigners, resident aliens in their promised land, and that all through the 400 years that the Hebrews were enslaved, they did remain foreigners in Egypt. They remained the entire time kind of a nation of immigrants. 400 years turned out, didn't it, to be an important number for the American nation as well. 2 years ago, we stood outside that door and rang the courtyard bell 400 times to mark the day 400 years ago when the sin of slavery first had come to our shores. So yes, in the law of Moses, at every point, God no sooner mentions the foreigner in your land than God digresses into how you must treat them. Why? Because you also know what it means to be foreigners. And don't you forget it, me hearties. But how have we answered God's kindness? Hey, now, we agreed to the covenant. But as soon, and I mean as soon as, I'm going to psychodrama here. As soon as you arrive on the shores of the Western Hemisphere, somehow you say it's the native peoples who are the foreigners. We're the kings of the castle, and they're the dirty rascals. God was watching. Depend on it. God was watching as the soldiers of Spain, as the settlers of England, and then the Scots-Irish, and then the Germans. When they had power to go into their land, they began to harry and make war upon the Americans who had been living there for centuries. Now get used to it. Those native peoples are going to be found clear across the continent, teepeed and lodgepoled and adobe'd from sea to shining sea. God saw us Europeans making war against the Americans who were already here. Would it not have been better? Would it not have been fairer to consider the European ancestors the strangers in a strange land, and to consider the Americans its rightful inhabitants? The covenant asks, what does the Lord require of you but that you should walk in his ways? Now this morning we have just this short bit out of the whole law of Moses, but including one verse earlier, it includes the warning that if we expect God to be our God, we are to circumcise our hearts. We are, modern Jewish translation, we are to cut away the thickening that has grown around your heart and unstiffen your necks. On this Independence Day weekend, the scripture lections led me to some serious reflection on our country's flag. I found a really great way to give equal offense with one stroke to both my evangelical Christian friends, both in this church and in other churches, plus to give offense to my honest pagan lefty friends who live in Santa Cruz. Yes, I can horrify both at the same time when I say to them, I have always taught my children that they are Americans first and Christians second. What do I mean? What do you mean? What do I mean? I mean that the doctrine, I won't use that word, I mean that the founding principles of this nation will always keep safe your right to trust and to follow Jesus, or to fast and pray during Ramadan, or to host a Passover Seder dinner in your home or in your synagogue. The founding principles will keep you safe because, as one of the founders wrote, this country is in no way founded upon allegiance to the Christian religion or upon any religion. I teach my children that a religious body, whenever it has governed nations, always ended up slipping into its own doctrines that are peculiar to itself, into public life, slipping them into public life and imposing them on people whether or not one assents to them. Religions that are allowed to rule nations have a way of becoming autocratic, busybody, and cruel. Another example of us, we were just about the only nation at that time where right from the start, our founding principles laid out 0 civil penalty for being Jewish. And another example, my dear friend Lloyd, we would talk about this occasionally. Wow, he would say, we have kind of, the matter of religious tests for public office. He would say, boy, we have drifted away from that shore, haven't we? He said, and not just recently. Lloyd told me, Carol, that when he once went into interview for a city position or a county position, he was asked point blank if he were not a born-again Christian. I honestly forget whether he said that yes was the right answer or that no was the right answer, but that he was asked the question was terribly significant. Okay, and to be sure, there have been times of private and just suspicion, not public persecution, but suspicion of this church or that one. And perhaps no Roman Catholic could have been president much before 1960, I don't know. And long ago, individual states were always willing to put Quakers or Hutterites into the stocks and into the jail because they would not fight in our nation's wars. But, and this is important, in each of these instances, the founding principle reasserted itself. Instances where we broke those principles were always, if belatedly, it is said we'll do the right thing when all the other options have been exhausted. Those principles were always overruled by our checks and balances and our public spirit and repented of. We're waiting, of course, for this healthy sea change to hit us in the present moment with our Muslim neighbors. But the fact is, this country has not always been good to Christians. I'm thinking of the matter of flag salutes. Going back no further than our parents' generation, Jehovah's Witnesses who have, you may know, very strict views on what is idolatry. As recently as our parents' time, they were jailed, their children jailed also for refusing to salute the flag in their schoolrooms. They were harried shamefully. Having sent the children home for refusing the flag salute, they then sent the truant officers after them to arrest them. Now, we Anglicans do not agree with their religion, but surely we may respect their witness. Our church rarely gets tested in that way. We have a pretty domesticated church. It would do us no harm to reflect on that from time to time. Again, we may not agree with them, and indeed I don't, but there is a moral for the rest of us. I think we more mainstream Christians do very well to view with a kind of very cool reserve the way that we in this democracy have sometimes consented to treat, in the name of patriotism, how we have treated many that honored no flag and yet were Christ's. Indeed, they have helped the rest of us to see that this is not a path we really, in our heart of hearts, in our inmost self, as the apostle says, not a path we really want to go down. Our other reading this morning says that we must love our enemies. It goes on, if we love our neighbors, if we love as neighbors only people like ourselves, that is not hard work, and there is no special benefit to us, and it is no special credit to us. In an earlier passage from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which this is, we see him comparing his followers to a city on a hill which cannot be hid. Its light cannot be hid. So let the light of your good deeds so shine in front of the world that they will see your good deeds and they will glorify your Father in heaven. And please, after that difficult list of things to do, like loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, after that list, Mr. John Wesley has a help for you if you've gotten stuck at that phrase, be perfect, because God is perfect. If you love only those who love you, he wrote, well, even the worst sinners do that. In the jail, I often would pray that God would open up a heart and bestow on this guy or on that woman whatever blessing God sees they need to become the person God created them to be. That they be open to whatever form this blessing. It might be easy, it might be a chastisement, but be open to whatever they need to get untwisted and get back into the state where God intends them to work out their life. Thus, Wesley means, in this way you will be perfect, he says. You will be true children of your Father. If you can receive the goal of perfectly carrying out these wishes and of doing things God's way, of playing this game as God wishes it played, you will grow into being more and more like God. And that is to come to perfection. A blessing, I pray, on our generous and creating God will scatter upon everybody here today, everybody wherever in the world you are. Be at peace, everybody. Go out there and do it and get some. Amen.